Hello, welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. This is our final episode for Self-Aware Horror, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the cycle finale. I don't know what you want to call it. We're going to be back soon.
Series?
Yeah.
No, series finale.
No, that would only work if we were British.
Yeah, that doesn't really work. So we'll call it the end of the cycle. It's the end of the cycle. And I don't know how we chose this film. I did not choose this film, did I?
No, I chose it because if we were starting with the new Scream, which originated with Wes Craven, it only makes sense to end with where Wes Craven began.
Oh, God, yes. Where did he begin, Chris? What is this film that you selected? I just want to point that out there. You selected this film. And I warned you.
You did. You gave me a very fair and egregious warning, and yet I still said, I want us to really take a close look at 1972's Last House on the Left. Why did I do that? I was.
You were curious, right?
Oh yeah, curiosity killed the cat, etc. But there is also a part of my curiosity that was very much like attuned to, and we'll get into this because we're also gonna have a little chaser. If we weren't getting disgusting enough with Roman Polanski at the end of this episode. I'm curious about this concept, and that's kind of why I think this new format is exciting. One reason, anyways, because when did horror movies become self-aware? When did they become kind of comments on the genre itself, rather than just, as we kind of talked about in a couple episodes already this season, just scary, Yeah. And I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts, but should we just begin with where did Last House on the Left come from, and then we can get into the question of how self-aware is it, which I think has. I mean, I'm actually interested in your thoughts on that even more than the shock value of the film, because I was not expecting it to be as self-aware as it actually was.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's one of those films that people seek out because it's an exploitation horror film, and the basics are this: Sean S. Cunningham was essentially a porn director. They called them white coders back then, but essentially it was a porn film. Graphic sexual scenes were in a movie, but they would put a quote unquote doctor before those scenes that would describe them. And so this is how they got these films into the United States and released. Like the Supreme Court was basically like, yeah, as long as it's educational, we'll allow it. So Sean S. Cunningham was doing this stuff, and he worked on a film. Craven was, I believe, a professor of English for a while, and he wanted to get into movies, so he moved to New York. He didn't really have a lot of work, but he, sort of got this job with Sean S. Cunningham to edit together, which is one of these white coder pornographic films. That's always crazy to think about. Like Wes Craven, I think he hid this for a while, that he got started in pornography. A lot of people would probably, right? Yeah. But later, usually he was a lot more open with it, and so was Sean Cunningham. So they sort of linked up together, worked on this film together, was a big hit. And then Hallmark Releasing, who put out that film, was like, hey, you guys are doing this pretty well. Here's $90,000. Go out and make a horror film. And that's essentially how this all started. I mean, and this is pure guerrilla filmmaking at its core. And we'll probably talk about the production a little bit later, but this is the indie of the indie. You can't get any more guerrilla filmmaking than this movie. And so that's the impetus of it. And, there's a 2003 documentary about this movie that's really good. In a lot of interviews with Wes and Sean. It's called Celluloid Crime of the Century. And so they talk a lot about what their thought process was in making this movie. And to boil it down, it's essentially they wanted to make a film that depicted real violence. And Cunningham specifically, and Sean Cunningham, you might recognize that name. He went on to direct and start Friday the 13th.
Right.
So also famous in his own right. Essentially, there's twofold here. One was they wanted to depict realistic violence on screen. And there's some story about how they went to see a Western film. with Clint Eastwood, and it was all fake. It was bad guys, good guys, and they were like, no, that's not the real world. We want to show realistic violence. And at the same time, we were in Vietnam, the United States, and a lot of footage was coming back to the U.S. of really graphic violence, really awful, terrible things happening. And I think that's kind of what they, at least, now this is one of these things where it's like you have the directors and producers talking about it, but you do have to take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
Because you're not really sure if that's what was happening back then. Obviously we weren't alive back then. They're reflecting on what they were doing back then, and with time you might see things differently. Do you kind of buy that? And not buy is not the right word. Do you think that was the true root of this from what you saw on screen? Was this sort of very intellectual perspective?
There's glimmers of that, and
Mhm.
I think it's all like hindsight 2020 too, because you see where Wes Craven went. Not Sean S. Cunningham, I don't think. It's very strange to me that I see a very distinct divide between like the the intelligence of some
Yeah.
of Craven's later films versus, where Sean S. Cunningham wound up. Uh, Especially because Friday the 13th is the original film is the only one he actually directed, and he stayed
Yes.
involved in the production. But as a filmmaker, I'm just looking at his filmography, and the only other film I actually know here is Deep Star 6, which is known as like one of the worst sci-fi movies of the 80s. So like the it seems like there's an argument to be made that there was that an attempt was made, but how
Sure.
much
Yeah.
that comes through, you also think that like maybe we'll get into the production of this. Do you think they kind of either A, got lost in the weeds somewhere along the way, or
Mhm.
just like let themselves get taken over by the exploitation of it all, and just kind
Yeah.
of indulged that kind of carnal instinct? There's something to be said for uh, having these kinds of thoughts when you're putting a project together, a work
Yeah.
of art together, but then also knowing where you are in the landscape of cinema as trash,
Yeah.
essentially.
No, of course.
I don't know
I,
I'm
I
curious.
mean,
What's your history with this movie, Dan? Because like I just saw this for the first time a few days ago, but you've
yeah.
you've known about this a while.
Oh yeah. So I went through a phase of like watching exploitation films, I think when I was in college. I was at a very conservative college, and for some reason, I wanted to see all these exploitation films. I don't know why. It was kind of a rebellious thing, I think.
Sure.
And yeah, so I saw this right after I saw I Spit on Your Grave. Have you seen that?
Mm. No, you've
Um,
also warned me about that one.
yeah, so very similar sort of rape scenes in it, like very explicit. And I saw it back then, and I had always loved Wes Craven and all that, but seeing it back then, when I was younger in my 20s, extremely shocking, especially for someone who grew up in kind of a little bit of a bubble. I'd never seen anything like that my entire life. And it was very unnerving and sickening on some level. But I think also at the same time, I've recognized what it was doing, because at that time, remember, torture porn was big. This is 2005, 2006 when I think I probably saw it. And so we were seeing this sort of very graphic, awful movies like Saw, movies like Hostel. And
Yeah.
I would see those movies in the theater and I'd be like, God, that's like gross and disgusting, but not really that unnerving. When you see something like Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave, it's way more unnerving. And it's hard to describe why. And I think it has to do with their approach here. But yeah, I mean, I've seen it, obviously that was like 20 years ago now. And this is your first time ever seeing it, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
It, did you have that initial, is there a shock for you in seeing it?
Yeah, I mean, there was also an element, of course, of like uh, setting myself up to be shocked, because of your pretty dire warnings beforehand.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, it wasn't quite as shocking as I had anticipated, simply because of that,
Yeah.
high expectation factor. But I do think that I think unnerving is a great word for it, because it's not even necessarily what's actually depicted on screen that
Yeah.
is unnerving. It's more the everything. I mean, and Craven just got better at this, for lack of a better word. He
Mhm.
he 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 knows how to place the camera and how to follow his characters, both literally and figuratively, narratively, in a way that makes you just feel on edge, like that kind of suspense
Mhm.
that is wrapped up not only in like the classic voyeurism of the horror genre, but also this really like kind of intense, sneering kind of I don't know. The thing that I kept thinking about obviously was, everybody thinks when they think of 70s horror, they automatically go to Carpenter's original Halloween, right?
Yeah.
And obviously there's a tons of voyeurism and camera following, first person perspective stuff happening there, and that's what makes Halloween great. But what Craven does here, 7 or 6 years earlier, is like he's he's doing that, but also like trying to create this kind of enveloping feeling where
Yeah.
it's claustrophobic and
Mhm.
it's almost like the feeling I kept like coming back to is like being a kid and like worried that the bullies are going to come beat you up, where
Interesting.
it's like it just feels so like rudimentary and primitive, to the point where it's just like you said, like it seems like they're trying to do that, but
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
because that feeling becomes so overwhelming, um, it's hard to see that in the moment, and that's ultimately, I think, what creates that very unnerving feeling. Like it's not just suspense; it's straight up like
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't feel like I should be watching this.
Yeah, there's definitely that sense of, yeah, like a taboo. It feels
Yeah,
very taboo,
yeah,
and that's what they did. I mean, one thing to mention too, the original version of this movie, and there's a lot of weird back and forth in terms of sources on this, but the original script is called Night of Vengeance, and in this documentary, Cellular Crime of a Century, they talk about this script, and some of the actors in this movie were like, "We read this thing, we're like, I'm not doing that."
yeah,
There's stuff that's way, way worse in the script. It's never been released, but they mention a couple of scenes in this documentary, and you're like, "Oh, wow." Like, just truly disgusting, depraved things. And that's not even what we see. So it's like it's actually a watered down version of Craven's initial vision for all of this.
right.
Which is just like this is like the watered down version. But yeah, I think like there is something about the vibe, to use the Zoomer term, um, that this movie creates. It is this sense of helplessness. Like you feel as if you are being kind of sucked into like a current, and like it won't stop.
Right.
And it's this sort of base primal violence. And it's not just the physical violence, it's the sexual violence as well.
Yeah, yeah.
That is so kind of just disgusting. Uh and it is hard to watch. I mean, I would never recommend anybody watch this movie. Like, I don't even care if, like it it doesn't matter how desensitized you are when you see something that's on screen. I mean, the goal here was to make it seem real. It seems real.
Yeah.
Like, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe the casting, the production, and why it seems so real. Um, but if the initial goal was, hey, most movies don't depict real violence, let's do that, then they hit the nail on the head. Because it does come across as very um, documentary, and that was on purpose. Like, they were working in an office where there's a lot of documentary filmmakers, and that's kind of how they learned to make films, was through that documentary style.
Hmm.
And you can see it. I think the one of the questions you had initially was like, did they get caught up in it?
Yeah.
I don't know, because one, they neither of them had hardly any experience whatsoever, and they said that over and over again in these interviews. We had no idea what we were doing. We had no permits. We just shot wherever we wanted to shot. I think it was like maybe like a 3-week shoot, something like that, something very quick, 7 days in New York
Yeah.
City, and then we shot it in Connecticut at Sean Cunningham's house, no less.
This is particularly funny to me because I recently watched Netflix's The Movies That Made Us
Yeah,
series, and there's a whole episode about Friday the 13th. And Sean S. Cunningham's a talking head in it, and he's
yeah,
constantly saying the same stuff. And this is 8 years later.
yeah,
He's just like,
yeah.
I have no idea what I'm doing. Like the man literally, his whole life is not knowing what he's doing. So
He's been pretty good at it, to be honest.
yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I think there's definitely a hint here that things got out of control.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about maybe like who's in this movie. Is anybody famous? No. Right. The cast was essentially who? It was like soap opera stars, I think. Friend Lincoln, who plays the guy with the gray hair. He was a pornography actor. So yeah, it was a bunch of amateurs. I mean, based on what you see there, did you feel like this was like controlled or kind of uncontrolled in some way, the set and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the acting in particular gives it that, in some ways it helps in that like exploitation factor, like pornography
Yeah.
factor, because it's bad. It's stilted. It,
Yeah, it's very stilted.
and the best editor in the world couldn't make a flow happen in any of the scenes of dialogue. But you know, I think this remains true throughout Craven's career. Um, he has a knack for knowing like what faces are going to like really give you an effect on screen. So like obviously Fred Lincoln as one of the main baddies makes a lot of sense. And now that you mentioned that he was a pornography actor himself, and it looks like
He
not just
continued to
that
be.
he directed them, he wrote them and edited them. So like that that and there's also that kind of really horrible history of misogyny and you know pornography production.
Yeah.
So he gives that sense that like he seems like a rapey kind of guy.
Yeah,
um
definitely.
and then more on the side of I don't know the name of the whoever plays the younger kid, who the more tentative
Oh yeah, so that would be
killer.
Krug's son, who's addicted to heroin. Right.
Yes,
Mark Scheffler, I believe his name is.
right. And similarly, like it was interesting, like getting a sense for some of those archetypes you would get, of like
Yeah.
the Jamie Kennedy style character from Scream, where it's like, he is very menacing, but also you're wondering like, oh, is he essentially harmless? And same thing with like the victims, like the main two actresses, Lucy Grantham, and who's the other one that she's also very interesting.
Oh,
The
Jeremy
plays
Rain?
her friend.
Oh
Yeah, yeah,
no.
yeah.
So Jeremy Rain plays so sort
That's
of in the gang. Yeah.
oh,
Who's the
she's Sadie, right?
Yeah, who went on to marry Richard Dreyfuss and have a couple children.
What?
Yes,
Insane.
100%. And they joke that her kids joke that she's in the worst movie ever made, essentially.
Oh my gosh.
Um, but who are you thinking of? You thinking of her kind of
Phil
uh,
is it Phyllis? The girl,
Phyllis
the
Stone? Yeah, yeah,
character.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's Lucy Grantham. Yep.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So that where it's that similar kind of um it's the voyeurism of like following the main girl, but then also like that sidekick character where it feels very much like Sydney and Tatum in Scream.
Yes,
It,
that's true. Yeah.
and so like the once again use the Zoomer term, the vibes are off, but like all the ingredients are there, and so like it's really interesting. And they managed to also like make the parent characters mildly interesting too, to the
Yeah.
point where like they get roped back into the finale in a kind of Home Alone-esque situation.
Yeah, it was kind of that's good call on a Home
Right,
Alone there. The shaving
right,
cream? What's
yeah,
that?
yeah, a tripwire, yeah.
And then
It's
the tone is really fascinating in this movie because it's like,
yes, let's get into
God,
that.
like I think the first hour is way more effective with that on some level. The last, it's only 84 minutes, so it's an hour 24 essentially.
Yeah.
The last part, I just remember during the rewatch here, the opening juxtapositions
Hmm.
were so well done. I mean, um, and you teach film stuff. Like, if you could show this in a school, you probably can't.
No, I would
Uh,
get
like,
fired
it's
immediately.
just perfect. Like the scenes of like the train, they're hanging out at like the pond, and then they're like, when they get kidnapped in the New York City apartment, and they're basically being sexually assaulted and beaten. Then it cuts to the parents making the cake for Mary and her birthday, and it's just like,
Right.
oh my god! And it's so on the nose, right? But it just works. It
Yes.
gets the exact reaction that Craven wants out of us. That,
Mhm.
like, yes, like they are in a very dangerous situation. What does this mean? I'm going to tell you what it means by showing her parents making a birthday cake for her. I'm
Yeah.
going to shove it right in your face. Which he got a lot more laid back with that. I feel like as he went on.
Mhm.
But Nightmare there's a lot of similar stuff in Nightmare, that sort of juxtaposition of
True.
the
Yeah.
warm domestic home and this sort of monster, vicious, horrible person who's lurking in the shadows or dreams in that case. What do you make it like? And there's also the comedic cop stuff going on.
I know. I
God,
love how
what was
much
that about?
Craven hates
Slapstick, a lot of
cops. Yeah.
slapstick, a lot of slapstick.
I mean, it's so bizarre because on the one hand, uh, there is like this. It feels so awful to say because this is a movie that seems to revel in depicting, like you said, sexual violence. But
Yeah,
there's some like interestingly progressive politics going on with how law enforcement is depicted, as well as this whole like cyclical nature of parents being concerned that the new generation, the world has
yeah,
become too dangerous, and the new generation is naive about it, which it plays super well still today. But you have like I don't know. Was there intent going in here with like saying, we have to? I'm curious about this with self-aware horror. We talked about this a bit on the
yeah,
Cabin in the Woods episode with Evan from Spoiler Piece Theater.
yeah.
Do you think that there's like uh, any kind of like formal calculation, or is it all just kind of off the cuff when it comes to how much comedy can we put into this and still make it like a really uncomfortable time, you know? Like,
Yeah, I think it was all intentional. It was
okay,
extremely intentional. In the same way that like Romero did that in Dawn of the Dead, where he has like the pie fight scene.
sure, yeah, yeah,
Right, like Craven is doing this on purpose it makes the scenes of violence that much more deviant in some way.
mm,
And so yeah, I think he's hyper self-aware. Like this is essentially, it feels like an art, like a film school film, almost like a
yeah,
student project. Like, it's so over the top and in your face with its messaging, which I find odd that a lot of people over the years have sort of not seen that aspect to it. Like critics and stuff like that. Like, even at the bottom here, we talk about, I think it's like a classic critical response. It's Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune. He basically, my objection to The Last House on the Left is not an objection to graphic representations of violence per se, but to the fact that the movie celebrates violent acts. That's not true, particularly adult male abuse of young women. Okay, I felt a professional obligation to stick around to see if there was any socially redeeming value in the remainder of the movie, and found none. I mean, I don't think these people are being dead. Like, I guess. Okay, so we know what their intention was on some level. We know we see it on screen, and then we have these reactions. What's the disconnect? What's the disconnect between what they wanted to do, what's on there, and then how people are viewing it?
yeah. I mean, so it always gets blurry, right, when you try to analyze intent. But do you think that there was what's the origin of the desire to want to depict realistic violence on screen?
Well, they say that Craven says specifically that as an anti-war person during the Vietnam era, he felt like the um, sort of censored view of violence as was depicted on film, specifically like westerns. They can bring up westerns a couple of times. and like John Wayne movies was being translated over to real world violence against the Vietnamese, in
Hmm.
the sense that people would support the war in Vietnam and support the troops even while we were just basically murdering millions of people over there. And that the truth of that violence was not being seen by Americans. And that's why they were allowing it to happen. So I think that's essentially his thesis, was that if you depict realistic violence on screen and it disgusts you, that makes you less more likely to support, invading a country like we're going to see pretty soon with Russia invading Ukraine. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like that's his thesis. Now, I don't know if I agree with that whatsoever, but I think that was his pretty
Which is,
pointed
yeah,
intention.
which is in line with the progressive politics narratively of the story,
Yeah.
because there's this, you know, never-ending cycle of uh, people in positions of authority and parents and uh, legislators that going it's gone on over and over again. Violent video games, violence in music, pop music lyrics. And do you think that what is so? We've also touched on this a number of episodes. Is this ultimately kind of what shoot makes horror filmmakers shoot themselves in the foot, because this is that genre that has continually garnered cult following after cult following, and yet gets barely ever gets any respect from like
Yeah.
upper echelon film snobs,
Sure.
just like mainstream um, adults and authority figures. Is there I don't know. I also don't know if I agree with the thesis, but it also it's a pretty bold thing to say, especially when you come from a background of exploitation pornography, which
Yeah.
is like literally, you know, causing violence,
Yeah.
as sexual violence against people that are in front of the camera by those behind the camera.
Yeah. I mean, it's I would say watching the 2003 interviews with Cunningham and Craven is interesting, because there is a sense that they're kind of believing their own bullshit.
Mm,
Where it's sort of like, and Craven won't, we have to say this, this is one of the most censored films in film history.
yeah.
It's been banned in several countries. It's still technically banned in the UK. You can get it, but the I think whatever it is, the BBFC won't give it a theatrical certificate, still to this day.
Mm,
Um, so it's a film that is very much in the gutter, so to speak. And what Craven has always said about this, kind of over his career, is that horror, because it's in the gutter, because it's viewed as this sort of very much other, disgusting, abnormal, deviant behavior, that type of filmmaking, it gives you paradoxically the freedom to do whatever you want and say whatever you want.
yeah. Yeah.
But the problem is, to your point, is if you say it in that format, not a lot of people are going to listen. You know what I mean? Like, it's a weird sort of thing. And George Romero went through the same thing with the Day movies. He could hardly get the Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead made. He couldn't get it financed.
Right.
Here, and he had, and those movies are just filled with social criticism. There's much like they're like political like papers at the end of the day. So he's saying all this intellectual, um, quote unquote deep stuff, but the people who see that are people like us later in life. Critics see it, but does the general public see it? And so it's like, is the message that Craven intended here? Who is getting it, and are they actually getting it? And there was an interesting comment. I love reading YouTube comments, because it's like, yeah, give me the pulse of what people actually are saying out there.
these
Uh,
these are you sure these are people? I've never met anybody that
no,
actually
no, no. Let's just
comments.
assume they're people. But underneath because this documentary is posted on YouTube,
Mhm.
and this really gets into the intention and sort of repercussions of what you're doing. A couple people quoted that there's a really specific one about a woman who said her husband went to go see this in the movie theater back in the 70s, 72 when it came out. And he said that the men in the audience were like hooting,
Yeah.
hollering when they were raping the girls and beating them.
Holy
And he
fuck.
said that he was so disgusted that he had to leave. So this is where the gray area really becomes, impenetrable. It's like, yes, Craven and Cunningham had this really highfalutin intellectual idea to show realistic violence on screen. They do that, and I think they're successful in doing that, with the intention that, oh, if people see this, they'll be disgusted, which they were, some, but it'll make them rethink violence. Maybe that's not the case, right? Maybe that's not the case at all. Maybe people saw this, like this person, who knows if it's real or not, and people celebrated it.
Yeah.
And Fred Lincoln, who's, obviously one of the baddies in the film and a pornographic actor, famously said, like hundreds of women were raped because of this movie. And he completely disavows his being in it. So it's like, you see, it's like a minefield almost.
Yeah.
And it's like, does the intellectual intent actually get out to the quote unquote masses, or is it completely lost?
Well, and
I don't know. What
then
do you think?
it's Ouroboros eating its tail 25 years later when Scream 2 comes out, and that once again, it's like an intellectual comment. That fantastic opening scene with Jada Pinkett Smith literally dying as everybody's, cheering on the murder happening on screen in the Stab movie, right?
Yeah.
But you know, we were pretty smart 13-year-olds,
Yeah.
and yet like I cannot imagine being in a theater and the people around me understanding like the nuance of that kind of scene.
Yeah. 100%. And like, just like currently how this movie sits, this movie is free on Tubi, on
Oh
Pluto
yeah.
TV. Like I watched and I was like, how is this happening?
I know.
Like, how is this out in the
Interrupted with
world?
like Tide ads. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. There's a whole other thing you talk about, like the internet and people. Like you can go on the internet right now and see people die. There's thousands upon thousands of people dying on
Yep.
videos and stuff of real violence.
Yep.
Oh man, I don't even know how to place this movie. It's like so tough. I mean, we do have to say, yeah, is it self-aware? I mean, that's really the true question here. I think the answer is probably yes, right?
Yes. It's the question of like message receiver, right? Like
Yeah,
a film can be self-aware. It's the filmmakers behind it can be magnanimously self-aware.
yeah,
And if there's a lost in translation effect, it doesn't even fucking matter.
yeah. I mean, that's true. That's a good point. Like, it doesn't matter.
Right. Like I
Um,
think they're like Cabin in the Woods is like the most self-aware film. I think
yeah,
we covered this cycle or volume, whatever, of film trace. And yet I'm sure there were still people like hooting and hollering when like they're getting gassed in the cabin and doing, the most obscene stereotypical things.
but then it brings me, what lights up in my head is Wall Street, Wolf of Wall Street, like
Yeah,
those
yeah,
films
that
that
same
are
thing.
supposedly parables of you shouldn't do this sort of stuff because this is what happens, become absolutely celebrated.
Right.
Or like Walter White in Breaking Bad, people
Oh
are
yeah.
rooting for Walter White,
Yeah, and like
and you're
wanting
like,
Skylar to die, and
and
yeah.
the whole point was that, like, no, this is like the
It's
worst thing in the
literally in the
world.
title. Yeah.
Yeah.
um,
So, but
th-
go ahead.
there was an interesting note here that you researched about this small movie theater in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, called the Paris
Yes.
Cinema,
Yeah.
when the movie opened in 1972. Because you know, you had this comment a few minutes ago where it's like, especially with years of looking back on film history and being able to like pick it apart, but like in the moment in 1972, on the one hand you have that YouTube comment you mentioned where it's just like the masses just completely misreading what's happening to them on screen, but like there's still something to be said, because I like this statement that the cinema put out when there were protesters trying to get them to stop showing the film.
Yeah.
They wrote in 1972, after carefully considering all the circumstances, management has decided to continue to show the movie. The difficult decision was predicated on the following considerations. The film relates to a problem that practically every teenage girl and parent can identify with, yet does not pander to the subject matter. The story does not glorify violence, nor does it glorify the degenerates who perpetrate the violence. We feel the movie is morally redeeming and does deliver an important social message. That's kind of an interesting distillation of, the kind of complicated morass that we've been swimming through this episode.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
on the one hand, I want to agree with that overall statement, but on the other hand, like even while just reading it aloud, there's still like those flashes of this awful imagery from the film that is going to probably take me weeks to get out of my head. But
yeah,
maybe that's the point too. I don't know.
it is interesting. I mean, the one that we can't take away from Craven is that this is a rape revenge film,
Mm-hmm.
right? Ultimately, the people who perpetrate these awful acts on the young women are killed in horrific ways.
Right.
And it's also the same thing with I Spit on Your Grave. And that one had the same sort of reaction when people saw that. She comes back and basically, spoiler alert, kills all of her rapists in awful ways. So it's sort of like, as much as I don't want to say Craven was, oh, he's such brilliant and did this amazing thing and was so smart. He did give the average viewer a pretty clear map to where to go.
Yeah.
With this film. And it's sort of like, on the one side, yeah, you don't know how people are going to react when you release something, but also you don't have control over that. And so, I think Last House on the Left is a film that, if you're into film studies and want to understand, the origin of horror films, keep in mind, this is before Texas Chainsaw Massacre too. So when
True.
you look at the beginning of modern horror, to me, it's movies like this and Night of the Living Dead in 1968. Like, this is really the birth of modern horror. And it's important in those aspects. And the censorship of it, to me, especially back then, felt very gut. Like a gut reaction to what was happening. I mean, you even had people in the production booths cutting the film.
Yeah.
There's like a joke where essentially, what cut are you going to get, because the production's going to cut the stuff he doesn't like or she doesn't like.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, it's sort of, it is a morass without a doubt. But my perspective is, this film definitely should not be buried or censored or pushed away in any sort of way. It should be sort of, I think, cordoned off, if that makes sense. I do not think, someone seeing this outside the context of a film studies situation doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Well, it's interesting you say it that way, because essentially that'd be like another kind of white coater loophole, right?
True.
You don't have the doctor in a white coat introducing the film, but you have like a film historian. HBO Max did this recently. It was a big, to do on film Twitter when they started taking some more problematic films from film history's past, like Gone with the Wind, and not censoring them, not cutting them, not taking them off the streaming service, but having them introduced by film historians that know their shit and are able to like place it in the context of, what you're about to watch. I don't think Tubi's going to do that for Last House on the Left, unfortunately.
No, of course not. And that's, I think that's my perspective there is, just watching this film for enjoyment, not right, probably not the right thing to do. As part of some sort of broader context and studying film, I think it makes a lot of sense. But how do we, let's transition over to a little lighter fare with the Fearless Vampire Hunters.
Well, yeah,
or killers. Sorry, Fearless Vampire Killers. Or pardon me, but your teeth are in my neck.
There's so many different names for this, especially when you go international. It was also adapted into a German language stage musical called Dance of the Vampires 30 years later. So this is Roman Polanski's fourth film, and it is, for all intents and purposes, the most outward comedy of all the films we've covered so far. It's not nearly as steeped in commentary like a lot of these films, it's mostly just a romp, essentially, with
Yeah.
Roman Polanski playing the assistant to a vampire hunter slash professor, whatever, played by Jack McGowan, who was, I guess, most known at the time as like the main actor that playwright Samuel Beckett worked with in
Mm.
Europe. He also had some memorable parts in John Ford's The Quiet Man in 52, and then Polanski's previous film, his third movie, Cul-de-sac, in 66. But probably what's most notable about the cast in this film is that it also co-stars Sharon Tate. This is on the set where Polanski met her, and they soon after became involved and got married, and then she was murdered 2 years later by the Manson family. So, like, even though this movie is essentially pretty easy to write off, just indulgence in terms of like it's literally just Polanski trying to have fun and make a vampire movie and probably have a reason to like go to the mountains of of Italy
Mhm.
to film something. But it's steeped in film history because of that, and it's using so many horror elements from the classic Bram Stoker's Dracula story to uh, a lot of the kind of Abbott and Costello
Yeah.
style. Bela Lugosi himself kind of, made that full circle throughout his career, as did so many other actors that played vampires or monsters in monster movies. And so this is where it really got me thinking, and I'm curious because we texted a little bit, Dan, and we both kind of agreed this it's kind of hard to get through.
Ooh,
It's not
yeah.
it's not necessarily entertaining, 55 years later, but it is a curio because, like, how much of the horror movie genre before arguably Craven and Cunningham resuscitated it in the 70s, along with Romero and several others. How much, was the genre essentially dead? Had we gotten so far into B movie territory by the 60s that monster movies weren't really seen as something that could be A, scary, and
Yeah.
B, intelligent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great movie to choose because it feels like the end of the line,
Yes.
essentially. It's so hard to put into words how boring this movie was to me personally, because it just did not have. I think it's hard too because, and this goes back to the whole self-aware horror theme, is that when you're doing commentary on the genre and other films, a lot of that is rooted in the historical context of when that movie came out. So when this comes out in 1967, it's looking to these other vampire movies that came out over the previous, 30 years essentially. Um, and I think it would make a lot more sense. And I think it's also a literary self-awareness here because,
Hmm.
Dracula has a longer history in literature than it does in film.
Right.
And it's sort of tapping into all of those things. And I'm sitting there watching it, and I was like, well, that's cool and all, but like we've also had 60 more years of vampire history. And so it just doesn't, it doesn't connect at all with me. It is worth seeing in the sense that it's beautifully shot. It was restored beautifully in the cut that I saw. It looks fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, really great set scenes, or set pieces, I mean. And it's, and Polanski is interesting, and, Sharon Tate is beautiful to see on screen. I mean, just, it's a very vibrant film. But the plot is just, it just reminds me of being a young kid and having to see an old movie. And you're just like, wait, what? Like, this is what's happening. Number one, I don't even understand what's happening most of the time because it's a different sort of vernacular of filmmaking.
Hmm.
And two, something happened in filming in the 60s and 70s that completely changed the whole thing.
Yeah.
Where this feels so rooted in like an old studio type movie, like from the 40s and 50s, that it just doesn't. The artifice is so strong here, and you look at it's perfect to juxtapose against Last House on the Left. because it was made by essentially people who are copying documentary filmmakers sending back footage from Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you could not imagine two more diametrically opposed films. And I think it's obvious where culture went. Culture went The Last House on the Left, for better or worse. It went down that path of trying to depict realistic violence to scare the hell out of you. Whereas the Fearless Vampire Killers, it's like an episode of Laugh-In. Like it's just
Yeah, it's
there's
pure escapism,
yeah,
which
and
is
fun in that, right?
mm-hmm.
But it's on some level this is actually a little bit more connected to Cabin in the Woods.
Yeah, totally.
Where it's the end of the line, essentially. I think Cabin in the Woods was the end of the line of the post-Scream era. Like you couldn't, where else are you going to go?
We come back around to quote elevated horror.
Yeah,
right?
that's what happened,
2010s.
Right?
So it makes sense. Once again, cyclical nature, I think, is a phrase that we've used a lot, and that is essentially what's happening. Which is, I think, especially interesting considering that a few years before this, Polanski makes Repulsion, which is still kind of seen as one of the more viscerally arresting films of the 1960s, and then would end the 60s with Rosemary's Baby,
which is perfect,
right? So to kind of do this in the middle feels like a diversion at most, which is kind of curious thinking about Polanski's own history, not just with the statutory rape, but also with the his family, barely making it out of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And he is an artist that has so much baggage, both personally and culturally. And this film really plays awkwardly, but it also played awkwardly back when it came out. A contemporaneous review from Ebert is one of his notable 1-star reviews from when he was getting started in Chicago. He said, "The night I went to see the Fearless Vampire Killers, nobody laughed. 1 or 2 people cried, and a lady behind me dropped a bag of M&Ms, which rolled under the seats, and a guy on the center aisle sneezed at 43 minutes past the hour. But that was about all the action. There wasn't even a dog that ran onto the playing field," which is just like pure, just Ebert at his, bad movies.
But
peak.
He's also like, if you read the first part of the review, because I came across it too, it's a very sort of like gonzo journalist review.
Oh, totally.
Right? So it's again that weird juxtaposition of like even the critics were moving on towards a different style and viewpoint of viewing film in general. And it's yeah, I mean, this has to be sort of the origin of what we're talking about in self-aware horror, in the sense that like there is a self-awareness to earlier horror films that's pointing to more literature than other films, but to the story of Dracula and stuff like that. There is a sort of intertextuality to it all. But once you hit the late 60s, early 70s, what is that shift? Is it more than just, hey, let's show real life? Or is there something else going on with the self-awareness? When we look at like Last House on the Left, what is it self-aware about? It doesn't necessarily seem self-aware about other films per se. It's more self-aware about actual like lived experience in life.
Right. And like you said, the documentary Vietnam aspect.
Yeah.
Of like violence on screen, right? The first televised war. So do you think that there's, yes. Do you think that there's a parallel to that in terms of like, as we were talking about, whether we look more recently, like the 2010s and the Cabin in the Woods being kind of a death knell.
Sure.
But then also like looking at the 90s and, the petering out with Dead Alive until Scream comes roaring back. And I mean, this cycle, can you match it up politically? And
I mean, you could, yeah. I mean, it's like if you say Cabin in the Woods is sort of the end of the post Scream era, and then you get into elevated horror, it follows Raw, Hereditary, Midsummer, stuff like that. The Witch should be probably another one. what I'm seeing there, though, is sort of like I always thought that, like, yeah, that was a return to the '70s horror filmmaking, like Last House on the Left and Texas Chainsaw Massacre specifically, and some Halloween as well. But what's weird about this sort of recent elevated horror is that it still doesn't have what Last House on the Left has, and what specifically Texas Chainsaw Massacre has. It
Mhm.
doesn't have it. Ari Aster, I think, comes sort of close, but I think he's too kind of full of himself to go there. It doesn't have the visceral rawness. The closest thing I've seen recently was the remake of The Hills Have Eyes
Oh
back in like
gosh.
2007.
And we
Which
didn't
the
even talk about the remake of Last House on the Left.
Yeah, oh god, yeah. Let's can we not?
Yeah,
Uh,
we cannot.
but I would say that, like, there is still something um unique about that time period in the '70s and what they were doing and what Wes Craven was doing. And yeah, it was a mess of a production, and people were really uncomfortable, and they got hurt mentally and emotionally by being in this movie. No doubt. And there's multiple stories about the set being uncontrolled and Craven not knowing what he was doing, and the female participants being treated extraordinarily poorly. Um, that's all, there for us. But at the same time, what's on screen is so crazy and unique that I don't know. Have you seen anything in recent times that you would connect to this at all?
May I point you to a little movie of last year called *Malignant*? No, I'm just kidding.
Just don't do this to me. I just literally, you said malignant, like a pit in my stomach. I almost threw up. It's like the worst movie I've ever seen in my life.
Oh God, I love it. No, I think that there is something to be said for, if not desensitivity, but I think, like you said, Ari Aster's Midsummer, the opening scene in particular,
Yes. Yeah. Comes
feels
close.
like the closest,
Yeah.
right, to that kind of just gut punch, and once again intellectualized, but how much can you value that when it just ruins your day? you know
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know, I think that uh there's terrain to go, but it is interesting to look at this in context of the reboot of Scream coming out, well, in the midst of people
Yeah.
pretending that we're not in a pandemic anymore. Where
Yeah. Exactly. And there's going
there
to be another world war or land war in Europe.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Like, it's
the, do you have like a sense of well, okay, first
sure.
let me run this down, and then maybe we can wrap things up and with a
Yeah.
question I have for you, because I do think you're right. I think that fearless vampire killers has that kind of um, energy to it, where it's like everything's empty, even though there's redeeming qualities to it. Um, but one other thing that's been curious about how horror films have been reevaluated as self-aware years later. 1962's Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, going back further in the
Mhm.
60s,
Yeah.
is an absolute amazing film with Bette
Fantastic. Yeah.
Davis and Joan Crawford, and it was very much seen as horrific and what that kind of visceral feeling
Yeah.
back when it came out. And there's still a lot of those elements to it if you watch it, 60 years later today. But it also has developed this huge reputation as one of the origins of camp, right?
Sure.
Of this kind of, I mean, use the word elevated horror. The movie also got 5 Oscar nominations,
Yeah.
even though it's got this kind of like wink in its eye where it's just like batshit crazy. Like it feels like the equivalent of *Malignant* getting 5 Oscar nods in my dreams.
Oh.
Um, then in further back in history, 1957, Night of the Demon, Jacques Turner, who made Cat People and Out of the Past. And if anything, I feel like that is that's a self-aware noir film. And so this guy created this basically satanic cult movie that revolves around whether or not the demon will be revealed by the end of the film. It's one of Scorsese's favorite horror movies, but it has once again been reevaluated over the years, especially in terms of like 50s special effects. And
Yeah.
you could say the same thing with like movies like The Blob and Them, where
Mhm.
they were definitely seen as kind of brutishly scary back when they were released, but are seen as like fun and stereotypical today. And then 1952 kind of coming full circle to looking at Fearless Vampire Killers as the end line of this kind of Abbott and Costello style comedy meets horror, almost like Mel Brooks' Dracula Dead and Loving It. End of the line, just really scraping the bottom of the barrel. Mother Riley Meets the Vampire came out in 52, which literally took the plot from Abbott and Costello Meet Dracula, but then played it completely serious.
Yeah.
So like this has been going on, since the era of Nosferatu and Buster Keaton, and it makes sense that these cycles are inherently cyclical because they live and they die and they are reborn again. But so this brings me to my question that can hopefully you can answer, because I feel so lost in it, having seen Last House on the Left for the first time.
Yeah.
As I'm pushing 40. And you saw it when you were in college, and I feel like our minds are so, like you said, as an act of rebellion maybe in your conservative campus. And I've also like thought way differently about how I view the kind of exploitation films that we grew up with in the 90s, like Tarantino films. And it's like I treat that so differently in my head now than I did as just like pure like curiosity and just like, I don't know, angsty male like hormonal shit. When I saw Pulp Fiction when I was way too young. How do you deal with that in terms of like, do you think that there's more than just do you think that there's a purpose to having these self-aware horror movies get to the young and undeveloped mind, or do you think that they're just for us?
No, I think that like you think about like Last House on the Left, and when he's making it, he's essentially making it for younger people, because those are the people who are getting sent over to die. 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-olds, all getting shot up. And like a movie like that is sort of like, it makes people, hopefully the intention is to make them question their world. And I'll tell you this, man, when I saw this movie, it completely, this and I Spit in Your Grave completely changed my perspective on human beings almost immediately. Growing up in a place where, I didn't see hardly any violence in Brookfield, Wisconsin. I didn't see any of this. And I see it and I was like, oh, wow. Like there's a whole world out there that I have no concept of. So I do think it is important that, and this movie technically is now rated R. So anybody over the age of 17 can go see it. But I think it's important that young people see these movies, but, and the huge but, in the context of some sort of, and this is me being a hypocrite. I'm being a hypocrite right now. I'm just going to call it, because I saw this without any context whatsoever. I read it online from like all movies, and it's like, this is a really crazy Wes Craven horror movie. I was like, what's that? Let me go see it. I think I rented it from like the Wake Forest Library, which I don't know they had. And yeah, I saw it without any sort of structure. I was an English major, so was Wes Craven. Love him. And so are you, right?
Yep.
It's crazy. You got to watch out for the English majors. We're nuts. And I saw it without much context at all, but I was also at the same time curious about how it came to be, why it was important. I was asking all of those questions as like a 22-year-old, 21-year-old whenever I saw it. That's not the case with some young people. Some young people just watch stuff, consume it, and be like, okay, whatever.
So you're saying this is my job, since I teach.
You are a teacher, and you do teach film studies. I am saying that no, like this movie should not be locked up and put away. So there's some people who are our age or basically sociopaths, and they saw this movie and might get ideas, literally. And so it's like, you have to be careful about how we're sort of delineating how to censor something. But no, I think this movie should be out in the open. It should be talked about. People should be able to see it. But I do. I want Wes Craven. I want a video of Wes Craven in front of this movie
Yes.
describing why he made it. To me, that makes way more sense than just watching this thing straight up, because it's absolutely a brutal watch that can absolutely change a young person's development mind, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get on that. Film Trace is gonna once again reboot as a
Yeah, true. Which is an educational resource.
Well, what volume of self-aware horror that this season / cycle has taken us?
Yeah.
We don't know quite yet what we're doing next. We have some ideas, but
Yeah, I'm not sure. What are we gonna do?
we're gonna
We're not
we're
doing
gonna
horror. I know that.
no, we're gonna take a
What do
break.
you think about rom-coms? Let's do.
Oh,
It's all. My two favorite genres are horror and rom-com. So
yeah,
that's where I'm at these
it's
days.
just a different kind of horror, but
Oh man, I love it. Thanks for listening.
good.
This has been Film Trace.